Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming out on this wet and cold and snowy Sunday. We greatly appreciate you being here. Today we have a fascinating guest, and I'm looking forward to hearing him speak. Ron Duncan Hart, PhD, is a cultural anthropologist from Indiana University with postdoctoral work at the University of Oxford on Jewish studies. He's the director of the Institute for Tolerance Studies, which is this information that you got right here, and a former university vice president and dean of academic affairs. He's been a Fulbright senior scholar and has won awards from the National Endowment for the Humanities and the National Science Foundation, among others. He's also written award-winning books on Jews in the Arab world and Sephardic Jews, and he is a documentary filmmaker for the Jewish Learning Channel. In addition to appearing on PBS programs on Jewish history, he has been an invited lecturer across the United States and internationally. We thank him for being here today, and we thank you for being here today. Enjoy the talk.
Lisa, thank you for that introduction. And I'm impressed. Look at this. Thank all of you who have come out and weathered the weather. And so we're going to take a look today. We have this special weekend, of course, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. weekend or day, and we'll be talking about this a little bit about that history and looking at the background of how all this came to be. And I wanted to mention that even though I'm going to be doing the talk today, but the person who has listened to all of these ideas and examined them and made suggestions and criticized them sometimes is Gloria Bella-Ballin, who is back at the camera. And thank you, Gloria, for helping to make this possible and listening to all the ideas. Lisa mentioned the booklet that you received as you came in, and that's some of the resources that we've developed in the Institute for Tolerance Studies. It's an introduction. It's not complete, but it gives you the door to get in to see what the rest of them are. And I think you'll find some interesting things there to explore. Is everyone picking up the sound okay? Yeah. This weekend is a unique weekend, not only because we're observing Martin Luther King Day, but if you were in services yesterday, the Parsha is Shmot, and it's about Hebrews in Egypt, the connected history between Jews and blacks who suffered the experience of slavery. And there's another connection to this weekend, which is interesting. On this same weekend, 60 years ago, there was a conference on religion and race in Chicago, and Dr. King and Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel met each other that weekend for the first time, 60 years ago. And in fact, on the opening day of the conference, the 14th, which was yesterday, Dr. King spoke. And he called for synagogues to lift up their voices about the immorality of segregation. And Rabbi Heschel followed him. And when he rose to speak, he said, at this conference on race and religion, at the first conference on race and religion, the main participants were Pharaoh and Moses. The outcome of that summit meeting has not come to an end. Pharaoh is not ready to capitulate. The Exodus began, but is far from being completed. In fact, it is easier for children of Israel to cross the Red Sea than for a Negro today, 1963, to cross certain university campuses. Let us yield to no bigotry. So his sentence, that last sentence, rings true to us today. Let us yield no inch to bigotry. And we follow in their footsteps. I would like to talk to you today about just a minute here. I'd like to talk with you what is partly a personal story, But more than that, the larger story about racism and anti-Semitism, white supremacy, and the interweaving of Jewish and black experiences in America. Jewish people and black people have dealt with the same issues of discrimination. The level of violence has been different, but it has been paralleled many times. So I'd like to look at the cultural roots of bias and prejudice that permitted slavery and the Holocaust in the white civilized worlds of Europe and America. As a young man, I had the pleasure to meet Dr. King and volunteered in his organization, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. I heard him speak on many occasions, and even though he was a leader of millions of people, a Nobel Prize winner, and a person who empowered people, he was very personable and very human, even speaking to a young volunteer like myself that was sitting in a chair there. I'd gone to Atlanta with the idea of studying a black community. But Dr. King's advice to me was, don't study black people, study what drives white people to be racist. And I went on to study that behavior and the ontology of European Christian exclusivism and supremacy. At first, I did that research on white Protestants in Atlanta, people who favored the KKK, and then later went on to study Spanish Catholics who expelled Jews from their country and burned thousands at the stake. All the time asking myself the question, why do the most ardent believers become so unaccepting of others because of race or religion? It's so unaccepting that they can believe it is right to use horrible acts of violence. When Dr. King stood in front of the Lincoln Memorial, again in 1963, but later in the summer in August, and he said that he had a dream. He dreamed of a day when black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, would be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old spiritual, free at last, thank God Almighty, we are free at last. In doing that, he was calling attention to the polarization in our society between black and white, Jew and Gentile, Protestant and Catholic. And we are here today to talk about that and look at the roots of it. What's the history that leads to this? As two peoples, we have both lived under the shadow of race and anti-Semitism and experienced white supremacy. From the Nazis in Germany to the KKK in the American South, racism against black people and anti-Semitism against Jewish people have run parallel to each other. And when one experiences violence, the other will also experience it soon. So today, what I'd like to do is to go back to look at racism and anti-Semitism in America. This intertwined history starts around the time of the Civil War. At that time, there were 3.5 million blacks in the United States out of a total population of about 30 million, so there were more than 10%. But there were very few Jews at that time, only about 50,000 in the United States. But even with that small population, the first major act of anti-Jewish act came during the Civil War in what would seem like a bizarre incident today. The United States General Ulysses S. Grant expelled all the Jews from the states which were under his command, Kentucky, Tennessee, and Mississippi, states where Jews would later be threatened by the KKK. When news of the expulsion eventually reached President Lincoln, he reversed it, of course, but in the meantime, Jews had already been expelled from their houses, their homes. After the Confederacy lost the war, the Ku Klux Klan was established to ensure white supremacy and suppress the newly liberated black people and the Jews who were arriving to the South to help rebuild the region. In that context, the KKK became what we would call today a domestic terrorist organization, attacking and killing both blacks and Jews who violated their doctrine of white supremacy and segregation. The first known victim, a Jewish victim, of the KKK was a man named Samuel Bierfield. He was killed alongside Lawrence Bowman, a black man, in Franklin, Tennessee in 1868, and this was shortly after the KKK was formed. Bierfield had established a dry goods store in the town and sold goods to black people and employed a black clerk who was Bowman, the man who was killed with him. In addition to selling to black people, Bierman also was known to socialize with them, which was a real problem with whites. To stop the mixing of Jews and blacks, white men broke into the store and killed both Bierfield and Bowman, giving a warning that Jews who associated with blacks or blacks who associated with Jews would be killed. Then the next year, in 1869, Samuel Fleshman was killed for the same reason. He was a clothing merchant in the Florida Panhandle, doing business with black people. The KKK ordered him to leave and to stop his business, but when he refused, he was killed. M.H. Lucy was next in 1871, and so on it went. Jews being killed because of the interaction with black people. Jews were seen as outsiders, and the fact that they would treat blacks with respect and socialize with them, sell to them, and give jobs, branded Jews as threats to the white supremacist society. Jews were seen as dangerous because they were enablers of black equality. The KKK was seen as a white Christian organization and literally included ministers of Protestant churches, as you probably know, as well as the church members. There are also law enforcement people in the KKK, business leaders and politicians. They identified themselves as Southern white Christians and used the cross as their logo. Their version of Christianity could not tolerate religious or racial diversity, and Jews, blacks, and Catholics were their targets. We were just talking with Mr. Block in Kentucky that you saw this against Jews, blacks, and Catholics. And although the KKK is diminished today, there are other white supremacist organizations such as Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers that we're hearing about. They continue to exist, and Jews and blacks are still their targets. In my research on white supremacy in the American South, I found people still speaking sympathetically about the KKK. People would tell me the good that it had brought to their community. And this is what I found in the research. People telling me this. The first wave of KKK activity was in the aftermath of the Civil War, which we were just talking about. But there was another wave in the early 1900s that reached a peak in the 1920s. And as the Jewish population grew with the immigrations out of Eastern Europe between 1880 and 1920, a wave of anti-Semitism erupted. And the KKK was re-energized across the United States, from New York to Atlanta and other cities, renewing its attacks against Jews and blacks. In that wave of anti-Semitism and racism, we have the Leo Frank tragedy. He was falsely accused and convicted of killing a 13-year-old girl in the Atlanta pencil factory that he managed. Although his sentence was commuted by the governor because of judicial irregularities, and it was widely thought to be a fraudulent trial, Frank was taken from his prison cell and lynched by a mob. The leader of that mob, Tom Watson, and I'd like for you to remember that name because we'll see it again, Tom Watson, reportedly told Hugh Dorsey, the prosecutor who was assigned to find out what happened in the lynching. Tom Watson said, "Hell, we can lynch an N-word person anytime in Georgia, but when do we have the chance to hang a Yankee Jew?" After that, Watson, a well-known racist and anti-Semite, was elected to the U.S. Senate in 1920. Leo Frank was not the only Jew to be lynched in 1915. Albert Bettelheim was also lynched that year, along with dozens of black men. More than 300 people were lynched in Georgia between 1900 and 1930. And I'm talking more about Georgia because I know that experience more, but there were replications of it in other places. Jews were only a small percentage of the people being lynched in Georgia, but Jews understood the horror of the racist death squads that came for them. But while this wave of KKK violence against Jews and blacks was growing in the early 1900s, one of the high points of collaboration between Jews and black Americans was about to begin. It was the interweaving of the good and bad in our shared experiences. There are some good things and there are bad things, and they're mixed. In 1912, the year before Leo Frank, Booker T. Washington invited Julius Rosenwald, the head of Sears and Roebuck at the time, the largest retailer in the United States, to join the board of trustees of the Tuskegee Institute, which is in Alabama. Then began one of the greatest collaborations in American history, and what they did was incredible. Rosenwald set up the Rosenwald Fund to help finance the building of schools for black children, and Washington and Tuskegee administered the project and provided the technical expertise. They built more than 5,000 schools across the U.S. South for black children. And this created a black-run school system at a time when southern states were not providing public education or any reasonable public education for black kids. That was the education system in the South for blacks for the next 50 years. 50 years, until the 1960s, when the Civil Rights Act was finally passed and segregation was outlawed. Well, we also get the Supreme Court decision that helped eliminate that. The Rosenwald schools provided education for such important figures as John Lewis, Maya Angelou, and many more who came out of those schools. The backlash against immigration was a big issue in the 1900s up to the 1920s that was factoring into this KKK resurgence. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, almost 15 million Jews and Catholics arrived in the United States, fleeing the conditions in Europe. The Sephardi poet Emma Lazarus wrote the welcome for them that is on the Statue of Liberty. The combined Jewish and Catholic populations increased during these few decades, increased 36 times, a 36 times increase. And it was almost, in the American population as a whole during that same time, increased 20%. So Catholics and Jews were increasing at twice the rate of the general population. It was a huge growth in population. By 1920, 23% of the American population was either non-white or non-Protestant. And in the 1920s, the KKK began making huge marches, tens of thousands of people in Washington, D.C., in New York City, and other cities. There's a famous photo, I don't know if you've seen it, that shows the KKK march in Washington, D.C., and you see the white-robed figures that literally are solid from the Capitol all the way down to the White House, a solid mass of white-robed KKK demonstrators, 1924, 25, something like that. So this was a time when Jews were targets because they were non-Christians, and they were not considered white, which meant white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. Jews and black people were not allowed in hotels or restaurants in New York and across the country and other places, and not even admitted on the beaches of Coney Island, if you can imagine. No Jews and no blacks on Coney Island. Well, it existed. Cartoons portrayed Jews as dirty and smelly and unwelcome in the United States. In 1924, the Johnson-Reed Act basically stopped Jewish, Catholic, and Asian immigration into this country. And that act stayed in effect, by the way, until 1965. 1924, Johnson-Reed, it was repealed in 1965 by the Hart-Keller Act that finally began to open immigration again. Housing codes would not allow Jews or blacks to live in certain neighborhoods. Parks and benches had signs saying, "No Jews, dogs, or blacks." And some of us are old enough to remember those signs. When Jews were trying to flee the Nazi atrocities and death camps in World War II, U.S. law would not allow them to enter the United States because Jews were not welcome. But while this wave of racism and anti-Semitism was going on, again, we get another side of the collaboration, the interweaving of the good and bad things. And a story of collaboration comes out to us from the great jazz man, Louis Armstrong. You might have heard this story, but to me, it's always a great one to tell. He tells about his close association with a Jewish family as he was growing up. He lived in New Orleans, and his father had left the family when he was young, and the teenage mother was working many times. He stayed with his grandmother, and when he was 6 years old in 1907, he began doing odd jobs around the neighborhood. And there was a Jewish family, the Karnofskys, who were recent immigrants themselves, a Lithuanian Jewish family. They had a peddling business, and they hired 6-year-old Louis Armstrong to help in the peddling business. And he said that it was more than just a job for them, because with them he found a second home. He said that at the end of the day he would stay and eat at their house. And he would stay into the evening, and he began learning Yiddish lullabies with Mrs. Karnofsky as she sang to her infant son, David. And later on, Louis Armstrong began singing those lullabies himself to the child. And he said it was with these songs that he really learned to sing with feeling. He was interested in music. The Karnofskys picked that up. They gave him the money for his first instrument, which was a cornet that he bought. As he became a professional musician, and to keep the memory of this background, he wore a Magen David, which was interesting. And he said that he's used some of the melodies that he picked up from that family in some of his own compositions, such as St. James Infirmary and Go Down Moses. General Colin Powell also spoke Yiddish, by the way, and I don't know how many other would have, but the story of slavery in Egypt, which Louis Armstrong was referring to there, has been one of the pivotal links in the shared identity between blacks and Jews. And we all know songs like Go Down Moses, and we've heard it from singers from Louis Armstrong to Paul Robeson, Marian Anderson, Mahalia Jackson, Fats Waller, and so many more. During the Civil Rights Movement, its most memorable phrase, "Let my people go," became a rallying cry that could not be squelched. Go Down Moses links Jews and black people to the experience of slavery and oppression. But recently, that story has come into question. Who were the Jews who came out of Egypt? One of the growing anti-Semitic narratives today is that the Hebrews who were in Egypt were not the people that we call Jews today, but were black Africans. People that, according to that narrative, it was black African slaves who built the garrison cities for Pharaoh, who made life bitter with the labor of mortar and bricks. It was black Africans who eventually fled from Egypt to the south, to what is today the Sudan, and then on to sub-Saharan Africa. According to that narrative, the people who call themselves Jews today were not the Hebrews in Egypt. This is part of the anti-Semitism of Kanye West and Kyrie Irving and others of that group that you perhaps have heard about in the news more recently. In the 1950s and 1960s, there was another period, a major period of Jewish and black collaboration in the Civil Rights Movement. In retaliation against that movement, there were bombings of Jewish synagogues and black churches in the South. In 1958, the temple in Atlanta, the largest synagogue in the city, was bombed with 50 sticks of dynamite, destroying much of the educational wing of the temple. It was a protest against the rabbi's support of civil rights for black people and his own personal working relationship with Dr. King, who he had invited to come and speak at the temple on occasion. 5 years later, in 1963, the KKK bombed the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, just as services were starting one Sunday morning that bomb killed 4 young black girls. And there were other bombings, of course. Dr. Martin Luther King and Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel led the collaboration in the Civil Rights March between Jewish and black communities, standing together repeatedly against racism and anti-Semitism. And many of us know the famous photo of Dr. King and Rabbi Heschel crossing the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama in 1965, arm in arm. On their march to Birmingham, defying the Alabama State Police who had attacked marchers on that same bridge only days before, on that we know as Bloody Sunday. 2 years after that event, I moved to Atlanta as a young faculty member at Georgia State University. In the shadow of the recently outlawed segregation, the governor was the guy Maddox, you might remember, who had the pickaxe. The awful stories. But it was in the shadow of that. When I arrived there, I was younger than many of my students, interestingly enough. While doing graduate studies in Indiana, I had a series of courses on Africa and the history of African peoples in the Americas, and going to Atlanta seemed to be an opportunity to continue that interest. But as I mentioned earlier, Dr. King very quickly kind of redirected me. My office at the university was a 10-minute walk down Auburn Avenue to the offices of Dr. King's Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Then another block or so and down the street was the Ebenezer Baptist Church, where he was the pastor. I volunteered to work in the SCLC offices and met Dr. King on occasion, and I attended services at the Ebenezer Church to hear his sermons. Georgia State was a mostly white university at that time. There were only a very few black students. And although Atlanta was 50% black, there were still not many black students had been admitted to the university then. The black students wanted to form a students' club, but they had to have a faculty advisor. And out of the 200 or so faculty members, there were only 2 who were black. But neither would be the faculty advisor for the new club. So the students asked me if I would be the faculty advisor. I was young. I came from north of the Mason-Dixon line, so I could fit into the community. Within a few months, the university invited Dr. King to speak to the student body and the faculty, where again I had the chance to greet him and talk as the only SCLC volunteer at the university. It was a time of collaboration and interaction between white people and black people. But all of that changed on Thursday, April the 4th, 1968. That evening, I began to hear the sound of sirens, many sirens, around 7:30 or 8. And turning on the television, I learned that Dr. King had just been assassinated. I canceled my classes for the next day and watched the riots across the country in major cities, like many of us did at the time. And on Tuesday morning, April the 9th, I was at the Ebenezer Baptist Church for the funeral service. And then I walked the 3 miles with a throng of mourners following the simple mule-drawn funeral wagon carrying the coffin of Dr. King to Morehouse College for the public service, where we heard Ralph Abernathy, Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, and others eulogize the fallen leader who had shown us the path of nonviolence. Mahalia Jackson sang one of his favorite hymns. It was a day of tremendous mourning, loss, and emptiness. Dr. King's dream of white and black people together without regard for skin color seemed to come crashing down with his assassination. Although Dr. King had encouraged the involvement of Jewish volunteers in the civil rights movement, from leaders like Rabbi Heschel to common volunteers like myself, after his assassination in Atlanta, I felt a retrenchment in that openness, not only in the SCLC, but also in the black community itself. After that, it seemed like a curtain came down between the black and white communities as the civil rights movement lost its most important leader. The trust needed in collaboration had been deeply damaged, if not lost. And shaken like an earthquake, the Jewish and the black communities drifted apart. My wife, Gloria, and I continued to socialize with our black friends and went to black clubs, such as the Pink Pussycat. I don't know if anybody lived in Atlanta at that time, but the Pink Pussycat and the Birdcage were the clubs that had the best music in town. And the father of a friend of ours owned a black hotel there. And he brought major figures like Ramsey Lewis and other popular musicians of the time. As a student, Gloria had been selected by the Social Science Research Center at Emory University to be an interviewer with black families in a research project they were doing. In the recently integrated world of Atlanta, a South American Jewish woman was a neutral figure acceptable to both Emory and the black community. Later, she went on to lead the introduction of the doctor's dining room in Grady Memorial Hospital, the large public hospital of Atlanta. But the drift apart was happening. International events were becoming wedge factors between Jews and blacks. And the 1967 war in Israel was one of those wedge factors. In the years after Israel occupied the West Bank, many in the black community began to perceive Palestinian people as a discriminated minority class like themselves. The Durban Conference in 2001 introduced apartheid language into the perception of the Palestinian situation. And there were many thought leaders in the black community who began to identify with Palestinians as people without equal rights. That turned into open anti-Semitism for some vocal leaders, such as Alice Walker and Louis Farrakhan have been. But there has been progress. Although the KKK and other white supremacist groups are still active in Georgia and parts of the South, there has been a change. Remember, in 1920, the openly anti-Semitic and racist Tom Watson was elected to the Senate after doing the lynching of Leo Frank. Of course, in 2020, 100 years later, we get this election cycle in which we saw John Ossoff, a Jew, and Raphael Warnock, a black man, being elected U.S. senators. And now, Dr. Warnock has been elected again. So the first time that a Jew and a black person were elected senators from that state. But as we all know, on January 6, 2021, the day their election was being ratified, we had the January 6th event. White supremacist rioters with Confederate flags and virulently anti-Semitic signs stormed and occupied the U.S. Capitol in a show of their force. In spite of the progress towards social justice in our country, racism and anti-Semitism still thrive among some people, some sectors. As the attacks, not only on January 6th, but the recent attacks on synagogues and black churches and neighborhood markets have shown us. Racism and intolerance is still with us. Dr. King had challenged me to ask, where does racism come from and why is it so deeply rooted in American life? And my study of white supremacy led me first to a white Christian evangelical Protestant community called Cabbagetown in Atlanta. So if any of you know Atlanta, you might know where Cabbagetown is. Then later on to Catholic anti-Semitism that I mentioned before. Perhaps the most famous American anti-Semite in all this period was a Catholic, Father Charles Coughlin, that some of you might know the name. Pope Pius XII would not challenge Hitler, even though he knew the extermination of Jews that was going on. It's documented. Anti-Semites belong to an extreme right wing of both churches, and I want to make it extremely clear that most Protestants and most Catholics do not follow nor agree with these extreme positions. But religion has been one of the conduits of white supremacy in our country. However, we have to go beyond Christianity. It's not just Christianity. White supremacy goes deeper into the Eurocentrism that is endemic in our society. Eurocentrism is the belief in white European exceptionalism and privilege. We rightly love European culture and arts. I love the music of Mozart and Mahler, the paintings of Rembrandt and Van Gogh, the philosophy of Spinoza and Rousseau, and so on. But because I appreciate European tradition, it's an error to underestimate the achievements of African, Indian, or Chinese civilizations. The Chinese have a long, rich history of music, literature, and philosophy, as do people from India and Africa. What do we know about the achievements of the great Ming dynasty in China, or the Mughal Empire in India, or the Benin Empire in Africa? Do we give credible weight to their achievements and brilliance? Maybe not. Because in the Euro-American world, what we are generally taught about is the greatness of Europeans. And Mozart was a great composer, no doubt. But there were other great musicians in other traditions. Do we know about them? Efforts to adjust those inequities have led to the politicalization of educational policy, including opposition to such things as cross-cultural studies and issues like critical race theory. And I'm an anthropologist, and when I began learning about the opposition to cross-cultural studies here, I was horrified. I mean, that's what we do. Jared Diamond says that Europeans conquered other parts of the world because of their guns, germs, and steel. And some of you may have read that book. Some Europeans have known from the beginning that genocide and enslavement were morally wrong. To give you an example, during the genocidal conquest of indigenous civilizations in the Americas and the beginning of African slavery here, and the two of them went side by side, the human rights of conquered and enslaved peoples were being debated in Spain. Now, it was in Spain because Spain was one that conquered the Americas. And it was with Spain and the Portuguese that we get the start of slavery in the Americas and the genocide of the indigenous peoples. Now, the English got in on it later and the other Europeans, but it started there in Spain. In 1550 and 1551, in Valladolid, Spain, the king authorized a formal disputation, a debate, between Father Bartolomé de las Casas and Juan Génez de Sepúlveda on the subject of the right of conquered and enslaved peoples. De las Casas argued against the enslavement of people in the Americas and argued they should have normal human rights, such as the right to life, health, and humane working conditions. But Sepúlveda argued that defeated and enslaved people were subject to the conquerors and were completely under their authority. He argued that the responsibility of the Spanish was to Christianize the conquered and enslaved peoples and bring them European civilization. In other words, the defeated and enslaved peoples had no rights other than what their master would give them. A group of elite judges representing the king were hearing the case, and they ruled in favor of Sepúlveda, as you might well imagine. The might makes right principle is not uniquely European, but it became enshrined in European colonialism, which many interpreted as a God-given right over other peoples. So what does this have to do with Dr. King and his dream? It is the origins of race and white supremacy in our European tradition. The origins of my own profession, anthropology, are embedded in Eurocentrism. The early anthropologists assumed white supremacy, and they justified colonialism. In the late 1800s, the early anthropologist E.B. Tyler was a Quaker. Henry Morgan was a Presbyterian. James Fraser, who wrote The Golden Bough, that maybe you might have read, was from the Church of Scotland. They theorized about the origins of human differences, and they defined it as an evolution from primitive to civilized. These early scholars put Europeans and their race and religion at the top of humanity. They saw themselves as superior, the best, which gave justification to occupy and rule much of the world in the name of bringing European civilization and Christianity to Africans, Asians, and indigenous peoples. It was a better way of life for them. Just a moment. So how different are the white supremacy and racism expressed in our society today from the Victorian era views of Tyler, Morgan, and Fraser? Both are belief systems that race-based assumptions about the superiority of Europeans. The problem is that the ideas of race and white supremacy are social constructs. They are not valid concepts scientifically. In other words, race is not real. Race is a European concept that was first defined in 1770. Could have been 1970, but it's a long time before that, 1770, in a book published by Johann Blumenbach. He defined, for the first time we get the definition of races as Caucasoid, Negroid, and Mongoloid. Before that, it didn't exist. Later, Herbert Spencer added the concept of social Darwinism, that social, economic, and political success were based on the survival of the fittest. Now, you might have thought Darwin had that idea, but that idea was coined by Herbert Spencer, a sociologist. And his idea was that race evolved into racial determinism, that race determined behavior, and that some races and some societies were more successful because they were the fittest. The ontology of European colonialism was based on the belief that European superiority was based in their natural superiority. They were the fittest, they were the best, and so therefore they had the right to enslave other people. That's where white supremacy, I think, is coming from. So white supremacy is based on the concept of race. Slavery and colonialism needed the concept of race to justify the European conquest and enslavement of people, and Blumenbach gave that to the Europeans. But with genetics today, we know that the old concept of race is not valid. It is still needed by white supremacy. The new science shows us that neither Europeans, Africans, or Asians constitute what we have traditionally called a race. For example, the inhabitants of the African continent belong to several different gene pools that are widely different from each other. The Bantu people in the west and the south of Africa are markedly different from the Nilotids in the east. Then there are the Bushmen and the Pygmies and the Hottentots and other groups who are genetically different from each other and from the Bantus and the Nilotids. I could go on and talk about the different gene pools that make up European society in the same way. Jews are a people with a shared religion and heritage, but genetics are different between Ashkenazi, Sephardi, Mizrahi, and others. Jews have different phenotypes and genotypes, different languages, different foods, different liturgies. Nazis used racist terminologies for Jews, but Jews are not a race, as you can easily tell by going to Israel. One branch of white supremacists in our country today are the white Christian nationalists that you might have heard about. They argue that America was founded as a Christian nation by white men who were Christians, and that they founded the country on Christian principles and with the intention that the country be a Christian haven. America should be ruled by Christian principles, according to this group. They say the United States has been successful because it has been blessed by God, and they see America as having a special role in God's plan for humanity. As I've studied this phenomenon, I've sat in on Sunday services in white Protestant evangelical churches, and I've heard ministers cite Hitler and Stalin for the things they did. I kid you not, I've heard it. They have threatened that communists are about to take over our country. But the word communist no longer refers to Russians. Today, communist is a trope. The word communist is a trope associated with what is foreign. and it specifically refers to Jews. The prediction is that when Jews take over the country, the Christian way of life will end. Christians will be replaced by Jews, blacks, and others. That is the background of the Unite the Right marchers in Charlottesville in 2017, who were shouting, "Jews will not replace us." When I first heard that, I thought, this is blatantly ridiculous. How could Jews, who are 2% of the American population, replace the 75% that is white? But as I thought about it, I remembered that one of the messages of white supremacy is the fear that their lifestyle and values of white exclusivity will be replaced by foreign, non-Christian, non-white forces. White supremacy, racism, and anti-Semitism are still with us and will continue, of course. And we have to educate each generation about it. But there are some indications of change. Some Southern Protestant evangelical churches today are looking how to separate themselves from their history of racism and anti-Semitism. The Second Vatican Council of the Catholic Church revised its position on Jews in the 1960s. Some of these changes are the result of Black and Jewish pioneers pushing back against the immorality of racism and anti-Semitism. Julius Rosenwald, Booker T. Washington, Dr. Martin Luther King, Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, and so many more who walked with them have pointed American society toward nonviolent coexistence as a better way. They have helped bend the arc of the moral universe toward justice. We honor the examples of moral courage as we honor the groundbreaking leadership of Dr. Martin Luther King today. And I look to the younger generation. Who will be the Dr. Kings? And who will be the Rabbi Heschels for the future? God bless you as you bend as you bend the future of the arc of the moral universe closer to justice for Jews, blacks, and all of humanity. And I thank you for your attention. And I believe that we were going to have a Q&A session.
Yes. Does anybody want to ask any questions? If you do, please raise your hand and we can go to you.
Yes. You might have to take your mask off too.
I'm a member of Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh.
Okay. Oh.
So
Oh.
actually, towards the end of your speech, those were also the words of the shooter. But one of my biggest problems is living in Pittsburgh a big deal of the time. The KKK is one of their biggest enclaves is in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, the Amish territory. I mean, the KKK is no longer a Southern.
No longer Southern.
And the biggest material that they print comes actually right outside of West Virginia, right over the border of Pennsylvania. So, you know, you could say, the new KKK that we're dealing with.
I'm sorry, I didn't catch it.
You have anything to say about the new KKK that we're dealing with?
Are the Proud Boys or the Oath Keepers? Or it's. She's from the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, and she was mentioning that, and of course, they had the terrible tragedy there of the shooting that killed 13 in the synagogue. And she was saying that there's a significant KKK enclave in Lancaster, outside of Pittsburgh, closer to Philadelphia.
But it's in an area where it's mostly Amish.
Mostly Amish, yeah.
They're not Amish people. They're hidden there.
Yeah. And it's close to the border with West Virginia then.
Well, no. Where most of the KKK publications come from is closer to Pittsburgh, but right over the border in West Virginia.
Okay, all right. So the KKK is no longer, well, and for 100 years has not been a totally Southern organization. It started in the South, But the 1920s, I mean, it was full in New York. New York was full of KKK, as was Washington, D.C., as was, it was widely spread 100 years ago, you know. So part of our comment is that, it's about what about this KKK today, you know. And, but we have to mix it in with the other white supremacist groups today, because it's one of the groups, but there are others, and we have all these militias. You know, Michigan has been a hotbed of militias, you know, armed militias. So the thing is that it comes out of this background that I was talking about, the belief in racism and this belief that of white superiority and white privilege and white exclusivism that really gets to the point that it excludes even the humanity, the recognition of religion. Black Christianity is not accepted, for example. I mean, it sounds strange, but it's not. So you have all of those. I was talking about the ontology, the study of what understanding reality is. People understand reality in those terms, you know, which are so destructive. That's,
Yes, I was just going to say that when I was living and working in Pennsylvania in East Stroudsburg, which is not as far west as Lancaster, the year before I got there, there was a KKK march right down the street. East Stroudsburg is East Stroudsburg, are very small towns in the Poconos, and there was no opposition to it.
no opposition, yeah.
The year I got there, outstanding, phenomenal African-American man in the military. There's a military base in the Poconos, not far from Strasbourg. And he stepped up and said, let's those of us who are horrified by this, let's do something. And a very small group, I think 15 of us from various organizations, races, churches, very small amount of Jews in the area. I happen to be one of them. And what the group decided to do under his leadership was to respond immediately. There were cross burnings in there that nobody had talked about. They were in the newspaper, but nobody did anything. And so if there was a cross burning, we would immediately, as soon as we heard about it, we would immediately go to the family and say, we would like to cleanse this. We would like you to know that you have support. And they would take the remains down, we would plant a tree or a bush or whatever. The same thing, there was a spate of people writing racist remarks on highways, but small, really small roads that happen to have a two-number highway number. And as soon as that was found out, we would go with black paint and cover up the white marker that was there. It was successful. It was surprising that in about 5 years, they went elsewhere. And it was amazing to all of us that so little, so few could do so much.
Could do so much, yeah. If I can summarize this quickly, for those who might not be able to hear, she was talking about in Strasbourg,
Strasbourg, East Strasbourg.
yeah, in a small town in Pennsylvania, but talking about the problem, the issue of the KKK having marches down the main street of town, unopposed, and problem of cross burnings and racist comments being written on highway signs and things like that. And these are the things that are so widespread in the United States. It's a part of the culture.
Thank you so much for your really highly informative and educational presentation. Maybe you could say a little bit more about the interesting conjunction between the white Christian nationalists in this country and their Zionism and their anti-Semitism, because it seems to me that their religious-based Zionism really has its origins in the inherent anti-Semitic beliefs.
Yes, he's making reference to the fact that the white Christian nationalism, people can include a Zionist component, and but it's an anti-Semitic Zionist component, because the idea is if they can get all the Jews back in Israel, that then all those Jews will be converted and they'll become Christians, and then their Messiah can come. So it's a weird anti-Semitic Zionism that is mixed in with that white Christian nationalist movement, and it's the wrong reason for getting all the Jews back in Israel. Seems to me. So.
Two quick questions. One is there any documentation of why those early Jews that were lynched, why they were so relaxed about being with the black people? Like, where in Europe did they come from? Did they come from places where there was more interaction with Africans, from around the Mediterranean area? So that's question number one. Is there any record of any of that? And the other one is the focus on studying the genetics of different groups of people around the world, is that in danger of basically saying, oh, here are the genes that make these people superior? And should we even be, doing that in terms of, well, let's compare this to this and let's compare this to this? I mean, we've established that all these groups of people are quite different and also quite the same. And can't we just leave it at that?
Yeah, the first question, did those early Jews who were associating with, that were basically trying to integrate the South at a time when integration was not permitted, why was that? If you notice the names, they were Ashkenazi names, so we're not talking about Sephardic people. Sephardic people would have had more, being around the Mediterranean and in North Africa, would have had more normal interaction with black people because they were in Africa. And we've had a great deal of experience in Morocco where there's a color blindness in a sense. It's the racism that we see in the United States you don't see there. But these weren't Sephardic people. Sephardic people had been there earlier. And so that would be another interesting thing to kind of explore. But this immigration that was coming in was of Ashkenazis. And I've thought about that, and I think the reason is that they were coming out of a position of humanity and inclusiveness. I think that's what it was about. So, so in a sense, you're asking why weren't they racist like the others? And I think it has to do with the Jewish principle of inclusivism, rather than exclusivism. Now, the other question about the genetics, what genetics, I think, has shown in many ways is, to me it seems, has been more of a leveling device than a device accentuating the differences between people. Because we can pick out specific things that have to do with certain illnesses or diseases, for example. But that doesn't make one of us better than the other. It's simply a medical identification. From what I've studied in genetics, I have not found anything that suggests that one group of people are more intelligent than the others, for example. Intelligence, and the interesting thing about intelligence, what I know, am I seeing Jennifer back there? Or, no, okay. There, a friend who's a psychologist might be able to comment on this. But the impression that what I've seen in genetic studies is that there's no documentation that one skin color group has any difference in terms of cognitive abilities and if I can take it even further back from this, if you go one step back from the genetics, I don't know if any of you have read the book by, I'm going to blank on the title now. There's a recent book that's come out by a couple of anthropologists who look at the humanity of the world. And one of the things that they make very strongly there is that across Homo sapiens, there has not been, Homo sapiens appeared a few 10,000 years ago, up to the present. From all the information that we can detect about Homo sapiens has always been equally intelligent. We're no more intelligent today, probably, than the Stone Age people were a few 10,000 years ago. It's the same people. What we have today is technology. And we've had more time of development of scientific ideas. The intelligence probably has not changed that much. And that's one of the theories today. And what genetics shows across the world is you don't find intelligence differences. Genetics doesn't show that. So. No. It was a more recent one. Yeah.
You know, where that was like trying to use genetics and proving superiority of this one over that one and tying it all together.
Yeah. Well, there are different kinds of learning abilities, and those certainly are true. There are some people who manage abstractions better than others. There are some people who learn more through writing, others learn more visually. And we certainly can find many differences in this. But if you look across the world, you'll find a similar distribution of those abilities, whether you're looking at Asians or Africans or Europeans. The same distributions are there.
You might be referring to a book by, he's an Israeli author named Yuval Noah Harari. And
yeah.
the book is called Sapiens, and it talks about
Homo sapiens,
that,
yeah.
It's just the book called Sapiens, A Brief History of Humankind. And
Yeah.
it addresses that issue that, over the eons, there hasn't been a change in intelligence. It's just the way it is engineered and used.
Yeah.
Of course, we also have the advantage of being able to read what was written 2,000 or 3,000 years ago, which people 10,000 years ago didn't have.
Reading and writing helps. Yeah. And that's one of the innovations, yeah.
So you mentioned how religion was a vehicle for white supremacy with the white Christian nationalists. And looking back at the civil rights movement, at Dr. King and Rabbi Heschel, those were religious leaders. And it seems like the opposition to the white supremacy religion was also a vehicle for the opposition.
It was.
And
Yeah.
today, I think that that religion continues to be a vehicle for white supremacy, but at the same time, I think one difference today is that the opposition is not necessarily supported or connected to religion. And I mean, here at Temple Beth Shalom and also the congregations at the Interfaith Leadership Alliance in Santa Fe and all around the country, there is still a connection where anti-racism is a religious value and a priority of a religious value. But at the same time, today, anti-racism does not necessarily have to have a connection to religion. And I'm just wondering if you think that that's okay. Is that good or bad? Oh, and also, kind of along those, or something else that's kind of connected to that is the fact that tons of Jews today do not believe that the Exodus actually happened. And I guess technically we don't have like real hard historical evidence for it. So we can still believe in it because there's not proof that it didn't happen,
Yeah.
but there's technically not proof that it did happen.
Right.
So that weakens that connection. And I think that is kind of connected to the fact that the opposition to the white supremacy is not necessarily connected to religion. So yeah, my question is basically like, what are your thoughts or opinions on the fact that today religion does not necessarily need to be connected to the opposition to white supremacy?
Okay. Well, one of the things that I mentioned and that I would like to reemphasize is that although religion has been a conduit in some cases, but we really have to go beyond that to the white supremacy that's endemic in the European thought. And so what I hope that came through, I intended to say, I hope I said it, was that I assume that the white Christian thought that gets to be anti-Semitic and racist is actually inherited from this European supremacy that was before it. So I mean, the roots of it are not necessarily in the, I'm not saying that it started out of Christianity, but that it started out of white supremacy within European thought, and Christianity picked it up, And I agree, and absolutely, you're correct that the opposition to this, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King was a pastor. Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel was a rabbi. So the religious path to opposing these is also there and very strong, And so religion can go both ways. So when I was talking about the issues of the white Protestant evangelical things where this has been a problem in the past, it's one belief system that allowed that belief to occur, the anti-Semitic racist belief. But religion in an equal form can be used to oppose it. Yeah. And it doesn't have to have a religious base. I mean, the thought system can jump outside of religion, of course. But when we see people going to a tree of life with the intention of killing people at prayer, there still is what's going on there that they can't accept. There's a religious antagonism about not accepting people at prayer who are of a different faith from your own, So there's still a religious component somewhere in the background there, I think. So, okay, wow, okay.
I want to harken back a bit to Martin Luther King.
Why don't you speak to the people and, yeah.
I think I could be heard anyway. I'm used to projecting, but okay, all right. That doesn't matter. My name's Richard Block. I'm from Louisville, Kentucky. I founded Actors Theater of Louisville in 1964. We announced the first policy of non-racial casting in the United States in 1965. We were written up in the New York Times at the time. And the woman I was going with, we were very active in the civil rights movement. King's brother, Reverend A.D. King, was the pastor of the Zion Baptist Church in Louisville. And there were many SCLC meetings in Louisville at the church. And we attended a number of them, Lucretia and I. We were very actively working in that. It was, I wasn't talking into it anyway. King there was a kind of a playful quality to him also. And he had a memory that it just astounded me. I'd only met him about 2 or 3 times when we were at a meeting at the Zion Baptist Church. I had to go to the bathroom, and I didn't know where it was. So I went on a hallway behind the altar, and there were doors, and I just opened one to see if that was the right door. And it happened to be A.D. King's office, and Dr. King, Martin Luther M.L. King, was sitting there at the desk, and he looked up and he said, "Can I help you, Dick?" And he had remembered my name, even though we had only met, casually at those meetings. There was also the Kentucky Leadership Conference, Christian Leadership Conference, which was affiliated, and that was run by the Reverend A.D. King, his brother. It's the civil rights movement. Louisville was, while we were in the South, and we were also, I grew up in the Crow, I grew up in that atmosphere. Louisville was a very liberal city, and the schools in Louisville were integrated immediately, the year after the Brown decision in 1954. The public schools were integrated without any friction. And when we announced non-racial casting in Louisville in 1965, we had no problems at all. There was no friction there at all. And I just wanted to kind of tie that in because it was a different part of life then. And we can thank Lyndon Johnson, because without him, we would not have had this movement at the time.
Let's go to somebody first who hasn't spoken, because we've got to wrap up a little bit.
I was just going to say that, this is a comment more than a question, that the Southern Poverty Law Center tracks, these white supremacist groups, and it's right on their website. You can see who's active in New Mexico and who's active everywhere, and it's really an eye-opener. It's quite chilling.
Oh.
Thanks. We'll shock each other a little bit. Ron, a couple of thoughts, and I can't quite tie together, and maybe you can help pull them together. One is that religion or any other belief system seems to me simply a vehicle for essentially reinforcing and defending whatever argument you want to have in many cases. So it can go either way. The other is that, and I think it's a related thought, that a vague sense of kinship tribalism is inherent in all of this. You have Hindu nationalists torching, Muslim communities. You have the Han Chinese torching, the Uyghurs. You have Ukraine. You have all of that stuff. And so, while a white supremacist mindset in the Americas in particular may trend from the core European experience, I think it simply may attach itself to belief systems, primarily religious, as a way of propagating rather than necessarily coming from the core religion issue itself. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, and one of the things, I didn't really get into the issue of the larger human issue of this thing. But of course, this kind of discrimination and using violence against the other, however other is defined, is something that happens in many human groups. So, we can, if we start tracing this thing back, we can say, the church was a conduit at one point, but they probably got it from European supremacy. But then we also have to go back beyond that to the human capacity of othering and attacking the people who are the unacceptable other. So it's something in the, obviously in humans are capable of this. And again, we talked about the differences between the various the groups, either Asians or Africans or Europeans, the people living in those continental areas. In each area, people have proven themselves capable of violence and othering, and it is a part of what we as humans apparently do. But the other side of that, and the reason that I would do this talk anyway is because I think we can do better, and even though Chinese can treat Uyghurs badly, incarcerate them and do all the terrible things that they're doing to the Uyghurs. Indian nationalists can be just as bad as European nationalists. The first state-sponsored genocide was not the Nazis, it was the Turks against the Armenians, and we could go on and on with the story. But when our version of it comes up, I think we can look at our version and say, enough. We can do better than this, and I think, it's this thing of othering is so widespread in human groups, and we really do need to get beyond the othering, But who knows? Who knows in the genetics? Is it hardwired into us in some kind of way but even if it's hardwired, we can learn. We're intelligent enough, we can learn to overcome whatever might be hardwired, And so I don't know if that addresses what you were saying, but yeah.
So, okay, so given how the Jewish community, by and large, was very supportive of the civil rights movement, and you said the first real wedge between the two communities was in 1967. I don't know, because Martin Luther King was assassinated
In 68.
in 68. There wasn't a whole
It
lot
had
of
already
time.
it had already started. The questions were already being raised.
Was that something that Dr. King addressed in his
He
community?
did.
Yeah,
He
what
did.
did he have to say about it?
He's when he addressed that, he said that that all as humans we all have to have equal rights, and he was very clear on that point. But he did not come out and denounce it openly. I'm sorry. Yeah, and part of that I think was because 1967. Remember, he was assassinated April of '68, so we're talking about months. The issues in the West Bank became more pronounced internationally later. And as I mentioned, like even in 2001, when the apartheid language is introduced, there we're talking about 30 years later. The question about the West Bank has been one that's been growing over the years. Did he anticipate that? I'm not sure. I couldn't answer that. Yeah.
Let me get this, and then David Schulman will have the last question.
We all have so many anecdotes that we would like to share. Just one quick personal one and then a question. My family settled in the South prior to the Civil War. And while I don't know a great deal of the family history from back then and what people thought, I'd love to know, but I did have ancestors who joined the Confederacy, and something I'm quite ashamed of and don't understand. But other parts of our family left and moved north at that time. But my question is, and It relates to two photographs that I have always carried with me because they remind me of not just my own personal involvement in the civil rights struggle way back when, but also of our ongoing obligation to continue the work of Tikkun and to never forget our obligation as a persecuted minority. So the two photographs I've always carried with me. One is the iconic photograph of Heschel and Martin Luther King marching together. And the other one, I've never really been able to identify time or place, but it's, and you've probably seen it, I'm wondering if you can identify. It's Martin Luther King with Abraham Joshua Heschel on his right, and then a number of different clergy on continuing in that photograph. And on his immediate left is Maurice Eisendrath, who was head of the what was called the Union of American Hebrew Congregations, holding a Torah. Are you familiar with that photograph? Do you know where it was, where it came from? Have you seen it?
Is that the one that has a building in the background?
Yeah.
Yeah, I've seen that. And I don't know the location. I've been curious also. I've been trying to identify the building to see if I could, but I don't, I know the photograph, I don't know the location, yeah. Yeah.
Ron, I hate to do this to you, but I think you have your history a little bit wrong
Okay,
on the partial breakup between blacks and Jews. Part of it started at SNCC in 1965, 1966, when Stokely Carmichael said Black Power and kicked all the white people, the white students, out of SNCC. SNCC was
Right.
Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And Stokely Carmichael kicked all the white people out of SNCC.
right,
A good chunk of those people were Jews.
you're right.
In SNCC, so the origin is prior to 1967. The other thing that really affected this was the dispute in New York City schools in 1968, where there's a big dispute over community control over schools, and that was opposed. And that was in the Ocean Hills, Brownsville, Brooklyn, which was a largely black neighborhood, and that was opposed by the largely Jewish Teachers Union of New York, and that generated also a great schism. So there's a lot going on
Right.
in the 65 to 68
Right.
time period
There,
that was
yeah.
engendering a conflict between
Yeah.
the two groups.
It was not all a direct line. Yeah.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, there were things back and forth. And in fact, in Atlanta, SNCC and SOC, the Southern Student Organizing Committee, were both active, but SNCC had that particular issue that Stokely Carmichael went off in one direction by himself. Yeah.
Well,
Okay.
I'd like to thank everybody for being here this afternoon. What a great conversation. I think you said it best, is we can all do better. And I hope that we can all continue to do that and work together. So I want to thank Dr. Ron Hart for being here. And thank you all for coming out in the weather today. If everybody on your leaving, there are some tables out there with some event evaluation forms. If you would fill those out for us, we're trying to get a sense of how you learned about this event and whether you like this event and what more we can do for our community. And Dr. Hart, did you have a last word?
Thank you for being here and the questions and the dialogue. Yeah.
about in shtetls in Russia, about 50 miles apart. And they came to this country and they were living in LA, running studios about 50 miles apart.